Wow, let me tell you, this is a moment to be remembered. The first launch of the point-to-point transportation network for SpaceX, utilizing the Starship to transport passengers from one side of the globe to the other in the space of 30 minutes or perhaps a little bit more. Look at those lines. Look at those unique and distinctive features that... Wait a minute, that's not the Starship, is it? I mean, it looks almost exactly like the Starship, but there's a few tiny differences. Are we looking at a SpaceX video here? Okay, wait a minute. I'm having a serious case of deja vu here. Let me think for a second now. Here's the Starship. Okay, that's the Starship, and here's this thing. Now, wait a minute, let's look at it again. There's Starship. All right, I think that's Starship. And here's this other thing. What the hell's going on? Well, last month at the 6th National Space Day in Nanjing at a booth operated by the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, which is basically the state production facility for Chinese rockets, there was a particular rocket that was on display traveling from New York to Shanghai in 39 minutes. And even though this isn't the video, it may as well have been. It was almost precisely the same thing. I mean, not only were the departure cities and the arrival cities identical for this Chinese Starship knockoff, but also even some of the virtual camera angles like this one were precisely the same. Now, I'm not showing you the Chinese version at the moment, but nevertheless, if you want to go onto YouTube, you can find it. The point of the matter is, this is a shameless copy of what SpaceX is coming out with, and China intends to use it for the maximum commercial advantage. The question is, what other purposes might they use it for, and what could this mean for the future of spaceflight? We're gonna find all of that out in just a moment. Hello again, and welcome to another episode of the Angry Astronaut. So, we recently had a live stream not that long ago regarding the same topic that I'm going to be talking about this time, but before I dive into it, I really have to wonder, and I did a quick short about this, what was in the mind of the individual who bid that kind of money? I think it was, $28 million? Something like that, to go up on New Shepard. What the hell was this guy thinking? It is the same money in adjusted dollars as Mark Shuttleworth spent to go up through Space Adventures to the ISS for days as opposed to 3 minutes. I just don't get it. And then I started doing some thinking. What if it's somebody who isn't allowed to go on the ISS? What if it was perhaps a Shanghai businessman or somebody else from China, someone who is forbidden to go to the ISS for various political reasons, but might be able to go based on the political influence of Jeff Bezos and his company? Or it could even go further than that. What would happen if it was Kim Jong-un's sister? She represented North Korea during the Olympic Games. That would be a huge political move on the part of North Korea to show that they are joining the international community, the international spacefaring community. And not only that, they would be one of the very first countries to even have an astronaut. There would be plenty of other countries that they could point to that haven't put anybody into space. And even though it wouldn't be them that actually did it, still, there would be that distinction, and they could spin it pretty much any way they wanted to their public. As a matter of fact, they could probably spin it in such a way to make it look like that North Korea were the ones who actually put her up there, along with, a few other incidental Americans that you might or might not recognize. Who knows? I'm very interested to see who this person is and why the hell he or she paid this kind of money for this short of an experience. It really boggles the mind. I really wish I had that kind of money to spend on something a little bit more important and a little bit more pertinent to, to the good of the planet, perhaps, than this. I don't know. Anyway, people, if this individual has worked hard to earn their money, they can spend it any way they want. Whatever. I guess I'm not one to judge. I've spent quite a lot of money on extremely questionable things in my life too. All of that having been said, the main thing I'm talking about, of course, is the proposed Chinese knockoff of the Starship. The similarity is, entirely too obvious. As I'm not going to show you the video that they, put out for this particular product, because I have a feeling that I would probably get a copyright strike if I were to do something like that. I just don't think that they're going to be, the Chinese government rather, is going to be very forgiving to anybody who puts out their material out on YouTube. I could be wrong about that, but also, I really just don't want to give them any publicity. Suffice it to say that what I'm going to show you, that is to say the promotional video for the point-to-point transportation of human beings from one part of the planet to the other in 30 minutes, that sort of thing that SpaceX has been talking about for some time. It's an almost 100% duplicate of that particular promotional video with computer graphics that frankly aren't as good. And so, it begs the question, can the People's Republic of China actually do this? Are they going to be able to pull this off? Can they produce a Starship clone? If so, how quickly? What is their timeline in doing something like this? How rapidly do they intend to copy everything that the United States and others are doing in spaceflight? And the most important question of all, what do they intend to use it for? Because there's been a lot of question, a lot of debate, I would say, at least in my own mind, as to whether or not Starship should be used for military purposes, even if it is ostensibly for peaceful military purposes, delivering emergency supplies, that sort of thing. What can be used for peaceful purposes can also be used for aggressive and military purposes. And, where this was just a question of morals, a question of ethics, that sort of thing before, now it may be a question of necessity, because I believe very strongly that if there are military applications that the People's Republic of China can use the Starship for, or the Starship clone, they are definitely going to do so. And I'm going to explain all of these methods and all of these applications and what they might mean right now. So I'm going to give you a quick review of the Starship animation without actually showing it to you. Instead of showing New York with a large number of passengers boarding one Starship, it shows a large number of Starship silos in a centralized complex of some kind, indicating that the Communist Chinese intend to have large numbers of Starships concentrated in one area. Now, the takeoff procedure is essentially identical, as I mentioned before, especially one particular scene that you're going to see here shortly. But as I mentioned before, instead of taking off from somewhere in the East River or something along those lines, it's taking off from this silo and flying through the stratosphere. Once it reaches suborbital flight, it separates from the Super Heavy booster exactly like this, almost no difference whatsoever, and makes its way to its destination. Now, the descent portion is almost a complete mirror image. This one right here, it's almost precisely the same, although the moment that it lands in Shanghai is substantially different, but only because the CGI is not nearly as high of quality. And then all of this talking about the transit times from one destination to another, that's left out and instead replaced by another type of ship that bears a great deal of similarity to the British Skylon that is currently in development, being launched by some type of electromagnetic catapult. But the main focus is the Starship, or rather, the Starship that isn't a Starship. And how does the PRC get away with such blatant copyright violation? Well, frankly, they do it all the time. They reverse engineer German cars and other cars from different nations on a regular basis and essentially duplicate them, having Chinese companies produce them instead of importing them from companies that had a wild idea about selling every Chinese person one of these cars. After all, there's over 1 billion of them. Think of all the money we could make. Well, you don't make a whole lot of money when they just copy your design and sell it themselves, and you can't sue them for it because any lawsuit has to go through the Chinese courts, and thus far the response has been, we don't see what you're on about. These are entirely different designs, and the lawsuits go nowhere. But surely a knockoff Starship represents no threat the same way that a knockoff Mercedes would, say, for example, right? I mean, reverse engineering a Starship would be far more difficult, and SpaceX has a gigantic lead. Well, that's partially true, but the PRC has a number of very distinct advantages in the process of development that will allow them to go forward a lot more quickly. For example, one of the reasons that SpaceX is launching from sea platforms is so they can have a wider variety of orbits to choose from without having to go over populated areas. As we have seen, the Communist Chinese don't care whether or not they're launching overpopulated areas, and oftentimes launch from deep inside their own territory, regardless of what threat that may represent. So in the future, the only way that SpaceX or the US government, if they decide to militarize the Starship, are going to be able to safely launch large numbers of Starships is to have large numbers of sea platforms, which is going to be both expensive and time-consuming, whereas the Chinese can build large numbers of silos deep in Western China for far less money and far more efficiently. Nevertheless, it's obvious that the Chinese are far behind SpaceX when it comes to reusability. In 2019, the Chinese Long March 2C tested grid fins like those used by the Falcon 9, and they've intended their desire to develop the Long March 8 to land on a sea platform like the Falcon 9 first stage. So they don't even have a Falcon 9 knockoff yet, let alone a Starship knockoff. But the fact remains that once they do have a prototype developed, they're going to have far fewer barriers in their way to continue this development at a quick pace, as opposed to the barriers that Starship has to deal with the FAA. And there's another key advantage that the PRC has over SpaceX when it comes to Starship development: money. Although Elon Musk is an incredibly wealthy person, the amount of money at his disposal doesn't even begin to compare to what the Chinese government has at its disposal if it really wanted to develop something like this. And thus far, the only government money that's gone to Starship has gone to Lunar Starship, that paltry $2.9 billion. And yeah, $2.9 billion isn't exactly paltry, but it's minuscule compared to the amount of money that China could theoretically invest in their own Starship program should they wish to. But okay, let's assume that the PRC can somehow reverse engineer the Starship, including the Raptors, assuming they somehow get a hold of the plans for those or are able to design their own reusable heavy lift engines. What sort of advantage would the Starship give them? Well, China has expressed a desire to start hauling large amounts of cargo from place to place on the planet by 2035 and personnel by 2045. Now, the U.S. military, as you can see here, advertises such capabilities as hauling large amounts of medical supplies where they're vitally needed in a very short time frame. And this, of course, is an admirable goal. But what happens when those ships can drop 100 tons worth of military equipment or 100 armed soldiers in your backyard in 30 minutes? Now, some people say, quite legitimately, that this would be impossible, that a Starship would create so much of a heat signature re-entering the atmosphere that it would be very easy to shoot down. However, this only applies to areas that have an effective surface-to-air missile umbrella, and there are areas of the North American continent, or Mexico for that matter, that do not have this kind of protection. Theoretically, then, in the midst of a military conflict, the Chinese, or us for that matter, could send a Starship into a lesser populated area that doesn't have a lot of surface-to-air missile capability, drop off 100 soldiers plus equipment to start wreaking havoc behind enemy lines. This is a capability that our enemies, as in United States enemies, have never had in the past. But, you might argue, our spy satellites would pick up the thermal imagery of any Chinese Starship launching and track it to its destination, so we would have plenty of advance notice of this kind of sneak attack during a conflict. So this isn't a problem, right? Well, the problem is, a Starship can also serve as the ultimate anti-sat weapon. In this case, it's being used to gather up a mini Starship, but it could just as easily gather up any military satellite, even those in geosynchronous orbit, without having to refuel. And this would not create any space garbage in the process. However, if you were foolish enough to shoot down the Chinese Starship with some sort of anti-sat weapon, it would create a massive cloud of space debris, space junk that would probably result in what's called the Kessler syndrome, a chain reaction that would destroy virtually everything in orbit, creating a cloud of debris that would imprison us on our own planet. Most probably, our military would not make the decision to start an orbital World War III in this process, but would instead just tolerate the Starship snapping up our spy satellites as we tried to do the same with our own starships. This is a very grim scenario, but a real possible one given the unique capabilities of Starship. And now that we have two rivals working to achieve the same thing, we need to be very, very cautious as to how these vessels are developed and what they are used for as time goes on. So as much as we might like to look at this thing as just an orbiting version of a Mercedes knockoff, it isn't. It's a shot across the bow from the People's Republic of China telling us that they intend to increase their power projection capabilities to a point to where they can put military troops and equipment anywhere on the planet within about 30 minutes, and also have the capability to knock down our satellites at will. How does the Western world respond to this? With aggressive diplomacy or an aggressive arms race? My preference is for the first, but we must be prepared for the second. As always, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. All of this is speculation, pure speculation. It is entirely possible that China intends to use their Starship knockoff purely for what they're talking about. Using it to transport civilian travelers, wealthy ones, we would assume, from one part of the planet to another very, very quickly, perhaps to try to dominate this industry, which, given the amount of financial resources that they have at their disposal, they might be able to do it. It's hard to say. They might use it for that. They might use it for commercial purposes, trying to dominate the satellite and space station market, since they are banned from using American, space stations, that sort of thing. They might try to establish their own infrastructure in space that other countries can make use of in order to try to beat the West economically. That's entirely possible too. All of these applications could be the full extent of what China intends, and they don't intend to risk any sort of aggressive military applications for the Starship clone. However, to ignore these possibilities would be foolhardy. We dare not look past these applications, least of which, I suppose, and perhaps the most obvious of which, is using Starship as a way of taking out satellites, an anti-sat weapon that is not going to produce any space junk, that isn't going to risk producing the Kessler syndrome and a chain reaction of the destruction of every satellite in orbit. This sort of, nightmare scenario. They can do this, and they can do it without a whole lot of threat of reprisal, because if we shoot down their Starship, a 100-ton vessel plus cargo, it's going to create so much space debris we may as well be committing an orbital act of World War III. It will destroy not only our stuff, their stuff, but European satellites, Indian satellites, just about every country's satellites if we were to destroy something as massive as the Starship in orbit as it's trying to carry out its mission. So these are some frightening possibilities that we need to consider. And granted, the whole scenario of using Starship, as a sneak attack method of getting troops to North America behind our backs, perhaps a little bit far-fetched. But if we did not have the ability to observe every move they're making, if our satellite network has been blinded, which would be entirely possible in a conflict with China, there would be nothing else to stop this scenario from happening. It's actually a little bit frightening, and it is something now that the People's Republic of China is coming out with a vessel identical to the Starship. Now there is no choice. Military applications of this vessel need to be explored. Either that, or serious diplomacy also needs to be explored to make sure that neither superpower engages in any kind of aggressive military behavior with this new innovation, with this new vessel. And I don't know what chance there is of that, but nevertheless, I would, of course, prefer a peaceful and diplomatic resolution to these problems rather than a military competition that might end up in conflict, and who knows what sort of consequences to human civilization and to the planet. Hard to tell. 2035, 2045, not that far away. We're going to be finding out very soon. If you like what I talk about, if you like the things that I explore that other channels may not explore, it's all in there in the description. I am going to watch Virgin Orbit and their next mission very soon at the Mojave Spaceport. I could use your support, and as I say, many different ways in the description to do so, and I promise to bring you back a really good quality event as opposed to some of the others, because I have done a number of technological upgrades recently with your help. But once again, not your responsibility to do these things. A like and a subscribe would be deeply appreciated. So until we determine whether or not, or what purposes the Chinese, the People's Republic of China rather, have to make that distinction has for their Starship knockoff, because they're going to build it. There'll be nothing to stop them from building it until we determine what it is, and hopefully it is indeed exclusively for peaceful purposes. Until that happens, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.